Greetings and welcome to the final installment of English and reading and essays for the Smart Alec summer session. I'll be your cruise director. I'm Maggie. So I'm going to assume that if you're watching this, that you saw the previous installations of the essay and English and reading sections for the SAT. So if you're watching this after the fact, I would recommend starting with the SAT and then going to the ACT. I think that's the way that a lot of tutors start out, first with the SAT, especially on the coasts, and then the ACT has only more recently gained prominence on the East Coast, traditionally middle of the country test, but is more and more common, and it really, I think, depends on the school and the county you'll find around the New York area. But I do think that the ACT is a really, really helpful tool because the kinds of students, at least the conventional knowledge is the kinds of students who do well in the ACT are a little bit more the kinds of students who get really good grades and are really, who are really sort of class smart. And then it's sort of outside knowledge and outside sort of logic skills that mean that yield better scores on the SAT. I think that's decreasingly the case because the ACT and the SAT have kind of merged, or they're starting to look more like the other. They're sort of taking the best parts of each test and making two tests that are more similar, which I hope means more kids who are doing well and who are showing the best parts of them to colleges. At the end of the day, that's what we're here for. So kids can show what they do best. So today we're going to sort of breeze through the ACT English and focus a little bit more on reading and particularly the essay because that is quite different from the SAT essay, and they showcase different strengths. So first of all, we got ACT English. Let's go to the first slide. Boop, boop. Okay. So one thing that I'm just going to acknowledge off the bat, I have been called out by my students on more than one occasion because I'll refer to the ACT writing and language and the SAT English, but it is for English. It is called English on the ACT and writing and language on the SAT. So these are sort of the mechanical skills as opposed to the reading comprehension skills or the writing skills themselves. So just fair warning, I might slip up on that. The ACT English section really is a feat of speed and endurance. There's no way around it. It's 45 minutes long. You squeeze in so much freaking reading into this one brief section. 75 questions. So, I mean, you're doing 5 questions in 3 minutes at that rate, which is just a lot of content to be moving through. That's the first thing that your students are going to respond to, is that their brains are not possibly primed to get through that much content that quickly. But much like with the SAT writing and language section, the ACT English section I find is often the easiest to make quick improvements on, because you just have to get used to the pace of it, and beyond that, the content's not that difficult as compared to other skills that are harder to teach on the rest of the test. So with the 5 passage structure that they also have, these sort of coordinated structures, it's different than when probably you all took the test, same thing for me, where they have organized the writing and language questions and the English questions into sort of more coherent topics so that they can gauge your understanding of idea flow a little bit better. So within that 5 passage structure, I will encourage students to time themselves for 8, maybe 9 minutes per passage. Like if you can get them to do 8 and leave 5 minutes to sort of budget, that would be ideal. So, you know, if you can get through those passages at that rate, it makes it just physically possible. The first time that I took the ACT, I think I didn't, and I'm a very, very fast test taker. That's always what I had going for me. I don't think I even made it to the last 6 questions. But then, you know, putting in just half an hour of drilling or 2 hours or 3 hours can make a world of a difference. Now I started moving at that 8 minutes per passage pace, and I was moving briskly, but I wasn't panicked. I think that's the number one thing to encourage your students to focus on with this particular section. I think just sort of general contrasting things from the ACT versus the SAT. The SAT versus the ACT, these people got to come up with some more dissimilar letters. I think it's a little bit less writing and information flow focused than the SAT, but that's not necessarily always the case. The SAT has been more recently rebooted, so there are more calibrations that are still getting worked out for them, but the ACT still has a lot of sort of technical and mechanical things going on. You know, it's a lot of commas, a lot of punctuation, a lot of correct word choice, but it does have sort of slightly fewer word choice in terms of the spelling, sort of for homophonic or homophonic, I forget how you say it, words, than they have on the SAT. When it comes to punctuation, they also love the Oxford comma. I appreciate that. One of my jobs does not allow me to use the Oxford comma, and it's breaking my soul. So I return to test taking for that purpose. The punctuation information is pretty straightforward. I find that students really struggle with this because our schools really don't teach the formal mechanics of writing as much as they used to. I mean, I've even noticed it like from when I tutored a couple kids for the SAT and ACT in probably 2013, 2014, as opposed to now. It might be a different population, but they are getting drilled on the formal mechanics of writing much less once they hit high school. They sort of phase it out by the end of middle school or beginning of high school, I think. So when you get students who are oriented towards those kind of grammar things, really take advantage of that. And if they're not, really encourage them to dedicate the time to review those things. It's amazing how quickly all those things can come back to you, the things that you drilled in grade school. So yeah, punctuation, it's important. Everyone should care. Let's go to the next one. Boop, boop, come on. Oh, here we go. All right, so these are just sort of, what is happening to my computer? These are sort of general strategies for taking the test. I would say encourage all your students, like with the SAT, to read the whole sentence for sort of grammatical consistency. Don't just look at whatever's underlined within the sentence. Read the whole paragraph for all the logic and writing things. Students will really feel an urge to just skip over if there is a block of a couple sentences where nothing is underlined. Not helpful. They can skim it a little bit more than they would be otherwise, but just encouraging them to read the whole paragraph will really, really help with those sort of general questions, those for the purpose of writing the paragraph overall. Do you think that the author achieved yada, yada, yada? Those kinds of questions really, really rely on those sentences that you can just kind of fly over a little bit more easily. Whole passage, same thing. This is something I talked about pretty extensively in both reading and writing and language for the SAT, which is that the greatest skill that you can teach your students, I think, honestly, is to listen to their own gut, to not look within the answer choices, but to read the question themselves and ask themselves what they think the answer would be, and then try to get the answer choices, try to get A through E to line up with what they think, as opposed to doing it in the reverse and trying to shoehorn what their anticipated answer is into the sort of pre-formulated choices that are really built to make you make a mistake. Oh, this is a typo. Oh my goodness. That says, then read all the choices. You know, anticipating the answer does not mean that you shouldn't actually look at all the possible choices, because sometimes A and E will both look really similar. You gotta, oh my goodness, new computer. Just gotta account for all the possibilities. Much like the SAT, they do love conciseness and clarity more than they value sophistication. They're trying to get as much information in as clearly and to the pointly as possible. I rant about that a little bit or 2 weeks ago. So for more thoughts on that, go there or email me, and I am happy to talk about the strangeness of the concise style that they prefer. In terms of teaching, this is one of the few areas where you can just instruct. There are so many technical things that you can just drill your students on. So many really formal and nitpicky things that you can teach. It's really hard to teach a student how to read. It's a lot easier to teach a student how to use an Oxford comma. It's just, yeah, review all those things with yourself to begin with, and then get ready to teach them in a more conventional pedagogical way, I guess, than with normal tutoring, which is so much about relationships and developing thought processes. This is one of the areas where you can just say, this is right, this is wrong. Enjoy it. It's a little easier. It's a little easier to teach than other sections. Do we have any questions on the comment thing? Doesn't look like it. It's pretty straightforward. This is maybe the easiest section to teach, and one of the sections where you can make the most short-term improvement with your students, and it can make a huge difference in terms of their self-confidence and in terms of their perception of their own ability to improve their score. So I'd say this is as a tutor, this is a pretty home run section. Let's go on to the reading, one of the most difficult sections that you could possibly imagine tutoring. Let's go here. Wait, I need to go this way. Oh, there we go. All right, so this is just a little bit of a review. The ACT is, oh, here we go. I need to figure out this computer, apparently. The ACT reading is structured pretty similarly to the new SAT reading, sort of passage, double passage, the sort of general structure of the sections. It's like the writing and language. It's pretty brutal time-wise. The ACT is more of a sprint than a marathon compared to the SAT. It's 40 minutes, 35 questions. You barely have a minute to read a whole, huge block of exceptionally dense content, and to read all the possible answers and to have your own analysis of the questions. So this is one of the areas that I think developing the speed skill is really helpful over time. You'll get 4 passages, one of which will be a double passage, where they'll have two different chunks speaking about nope, that's it. Talking about the same content. Unlike on the SAT, I would say that the sort of foundational documents are not as present. On the ACT, that's sort of like old political philosophy, I suppose would be the best way to put it. But they'll have a double passage oftentimes in the humanities section or in the literature section, which can often actually be more dense because they're talking about very theoretical things. They also start with literature, a lot of times literary narrative, pretty straightforward short stories or excerpts from novels. They will try to sneak in some really difficult and lofty college level reading that I think a lot of your 16-year-old students are not going to be ready to read quite yet, but taking the time to get adjusted to that kind of really dense reading will pay off, I think, further down the road. The social science students will think like, oh, I'm not good at history, but this is really just about reading some data that's integrated very gently within the passage. If your students are reading, I don't know, Newsweek or The Atlantic or that kind of thing, or the paper, then this will be a snap. If not, I've recommended that to a couple students, and once a week read a couple pages of the paper, and that'll help you get more adjusted to the social science section. And then there's the greatest bear of them all, the humanities section. Of course, you think, oh, it's just, fluffy poetry and talking about art and talking about life and language. The humanities section on the ACT is truly challenging. They will find some of the most lofty, sort of elevated content that you can possibly imagine. I mean, I've seen them put really difficult theoretical writings that you would be reading in advanced level college classes on the humanities section. So that's just something to be aware of. Your students are going to freak out the first couple of humanities sections that they do. There's a very strange Annie Dillard essay once. It's not easy. There's no way around it. These are much less tangible works of writing than your students are accustomed to dealing with. And to go from just trying to get really, really clear and straightforward writing from social science to jumping into these sort of very, very lofty philosophical musings on art and the nature of humanity is quite difficult. So that's just a jump to be aware of that your students will probably struggle with. And then there is a science reading. You may be thinking, oh, Maggie, isn't there a whole freaking science section on this test? Well, they do like to have a little bit more technical science writing. A lot of times it'll be about, prehistoric blah, 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 or something environmental. So there is a little bit more of a social context and historical context, but a lot of times they'll be laying out the design or development of an experiment or a theory, and so it does really integrate those ideas. I think that is, at the end of the day, the thing that the ACT still consistently does much better than the SAT is to account for science and data skills that are not just raw math. All right, let's go to the next one. Okay, this is just a little bit of a review. Things that are true of both the SAT and the ACT. In terms of prepping, you don't need outside knowledge. Students think they do, but that's just a source of panic that they have. If anything, outside knowledge can hinder you. You do need to shed your own opinions. Just because you've read something and you know something and you have your own opinions about something, at foundational documents in the SAT, I'm looking at you. You do need to think of it as objectively as possible and to think about your analysis based on what the author is saying. In terms of the actual reading of it, first and last sentences of the passage are always a good guidepost, and your little baby guideposts are the first and last sentences of every paragraph. They select reading that that is structured that way. It's almost legalistic in the sort of clarity and conciseness of it, but it does give you little handholds as you're moving through the writing. The main ideas of each paragraph are just as applicable to the ACT, that sort of strategy, as to the SAT. If you want to talk more about that, just let me know. I'm around. And we talked about that pretty extensively 2 weeks ago for the SAT reading. And then transition and comparison and contrasting words are always helpful to just underline or circle so that you have a more of a visual. For me, like I do little arrows and X's and O's and that kind of thing for a little bit more of a visual representation of the way that the information is flowing. Okay, and the reading itself, same thing. The reading itself, your students are accustomed to needing to go back and reread things. They'll spend, 3 minutes on a page of a book that they read in English class because they're trying to, read it the most thoroughly and do the best work of anyone in the class. But that is not the kind of reading strategy that they can apply here. Spending time on the big ideas, tracking the general knowledge, and then flipping back to check on the details will help them so much more. Remind them your greatest mantra will be, this is an open book test. You can flip back and you can look. They're not really accustomed to that in their reading quizzes where they're being drilled on who said what. But it really is about tracking ideas and tracking flow as opposed to memorizing little baby details. They don't do much visual data representation on the ACT, or haven't in a couple years. Just something, skip it, reinforce that on all the tests. With confusing words and sentences, there's really no greater trap. You gotta just blow right through them. They will slow you down, and in particular in the ACT, the timing is 90% of the game. If you're struggling, you just gotta move on. Your students are not accustomed to doing that. That is not the kind of testing that they're accustomed to. It's not the type of assessment that they're accustomed to. The more you can reinforce the need to move on, the better. Okay, and in terms of the answering, anticipating what you think the answer is going to be, it's going to save your hiney every day. Going back to the passage and anticipating from there, same thing. If within the answer choices there's something that's completely nonsensical, yes, they will have the impulse to laugh, but the most important thing you can do is just to cut it out, to literally cross it out on the page. A number of times students will say, like, oh, it sounded stupid, and then I figured, oh, if it sounds stupid, maybe I'm stupid, and I need to go back. Maybe there's brilliance, there's genius hidden within the stupid. No, if you think that it's stupid, it's probably stupid. This is the most explicit way that you could possibly tell your 16-year-old students. Reading the whole sentence that includes the line in question, if the question is about a specific line or a specific phrase, and then the sentence before and the sentence after will give you the context. Wonderful. Anyone have any questions? I'm going to try to get the little chat thing. Where did I put it? Here we go. All right. If there are not any questions, I'm talking very quickly. I will slow down a little bit. I'll give another moment in case anyone has burning needs. All right. This is probably, I do think that we're going to be a little bit backloaded today in terms of the essay. The ACT essay is quite different from the SAT essay, which is one of the great difficulties of teaching both of them together. I know that I accidentally went into an early session with a student a couple of years ago who was asking me about the difference between the essays, and I like articulated everything about the difference between the essays, except for that I said that each, like I said the opposite name of each of them. And so when I gave him a practice essay, things did not go well, and I apologized as profusely as I could. The ACT essay is in many ways much more similar to what your students have done in high school. They are more used to, you know, being in a speech or debate class, and to looking at sort of political issues in a history class, and then having a debate in those kinds of classes. This is much more similar to that kind of rhetoric and that kind of writing. Much like with the SAT, it's not required by most schools, but for just about any student who you think is definitely going to apply to elite schools, or should apply to elite schools, or could apply to a school that's you know, super duper competitive, just really drive home the how safe and helpful it can be to just have an essay score in your back pocket. So this essay is a quite brutal 40 minutes. Again, how these students survive taking some of these tests weekend after weekend is beyond me. There is a prompt that will describe some kind of complex issue, like a big world shaping issue, big questions about you know, the debate between censorship and protecting the children, debates about public health versus restriction of individual freedoms, like really sort of interesting, broad philosophical issues. And then they'll give you these three little boxes most of the time. They'll say, you know, perspective one, blah, 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 about civil liberties. Perspective two, the children are all that matter. Perspective three, something else. And so they'll give you a sort of little mini paragraph about the role that debate plays in the world, and then I'll give you sort of three simplified, distilled versions of what that looks like in the real world. And then your prompt will ask you to analyze and evaluate these three different perspectives. So analyze, like give sort of to identify the strengths and weaknesses of each perspective, and then evaluate to assign a value to it, to grade its validity in terms of your own point of view. You can sort of offer a distinct perspective, maybe agreeing with one of the three perspectives or fusing some of the perspectives, and then coming up with your own sort of articulation of what you think the strongest version of it is. So this is very, very dissimilar from the SAT essays you're probably getting by now. It is, what was I just gonna say? Oh, the first person is probably the first thing that they're gonna notice. You can use the first person here. It is about your analysis and your evaluation of the situation. It doesn't have to necessarily be personal, which your students will struggle with. I mean, if they have a really, really, really specific, really personal connection to an issue, then that's great. But in most cases, they're going to want to keep this personal but hypothetical, if that makes sense. It is really about their own sort of intellectual thoughts, but expressed in the first person. I personally have taken several sort of practice ACT essays where I found that the easiest, sometimes the easiest argument to make is not even the one that I personally hold. Some of the issues, you can make a more cut and dry argument. And I think that for some of your students who are struggling to articulate what their own opinions are, who have really complex ideas or are just looking for the most provable point of view, they can take that same route. But it all should generally be expressed in a formal first person. So it's graded out of 12. There are 2 different graders who give you also these sub-scores. Their grading system on the essay doesn't fully make sense. But out of 12, and then they'll average the 2 essays. So if you get an 8 from one score and a 10 from another, you end up with a 9 on the essay. You are, even kids who are pretty smart, who are relatively high achieving and who are, thinking about these issues and who could articulate to you in person a really smart argument, will end up with some pretty low scores. That's just something to know, that we've all kind of been desensitized to the weird scaling of these tests, and I think that students and tutors are also just needing to adjust to that strange scaling of it. They give you the sub-scores on 4 different fronts, which are analysis. Basically, do you understand what the prompt was, and are you drawing the proper parallels and the proper comparisons and contrasts? 2, development, aka support, the examples that you use, and the way that you contribute to your argument. 3, organization, the structure of your argument, and 4, language, the mechanics of writing, and diction, and all those kinds of things that all your students will be handling. I do think that this, like the SAT essays and many AP tests, a 5-paragraph essay is not anything to be afraid of. I think 5+ paragraphs should be your go-to when it comes to this, because you do need to be attacking 3 different perspectives, or you need to address 3 different perspectives, and you're going to need some time to either debunk or support an individual perspective. I often encourage students to do, sort of 3 briefer body paragraphs about analyzing each one of those, and then maybe the 4th body paragraph is about their own personal sort of articulating their own fusion of perspectives of I agree with 1 and 3, but with only A, B, and C caveats. Then you're going to need a paragraph for that. A lot of times a counter-argument paragraph would be really, really helpful to sort of to round it out before you get to your conclusion and drive your point home again. And then the most important thing I think you can possibly impart to your students is the need to plan and pre-write what you're going to say. There is no way, if you know someone who could write an essay that scores 12 off the top of their head after reading the prompt, please send them my way and have them teach me their ways. But the planning and pre-writing on this section can make a world of a difference. Students think that they're if it's, I'm not that's smart. I'm not that good of a writer. I'm going to fall behind. But there are honestly, anyone on the planet would rather read something that has some structure and some flow to it, that is maybe a little bit less padded with details than a fully fleshed out essay, as opposed to something that was just like a free write about these general issues. What they should be hoping for on any of these essays, ACT or SAT, or frankly on the AP test as well, is for a strong first draft. So it has the structure and shape of a strong essay, even if it's not fully fleshed out in terms of all the details. You want the core of the argument to be there, as opposed to having all like two perfect examples for each body paragraph. I think drawing the connections between different ideas is so much more important than having a perfect example of everything. We have any questions on the essay? I know that I talk very fast, and this is obviously a lot of content.
I had a question just about in terms of recommending the essay for students who, like, you mentioned that you recommend it for students applying to elite schools.
I think you should recommend it to anyone.
Okay.
Like, I think that sometimes students will give you like some crap about how they don't need to take it. And they'll say like, oh, well, not every school needs it. You don't want them to wake up 6 months later and realize that their dream school is a school that does require it. That's really, I think, my impulse in saying that any student who could theoretically want to go to, I mean, it's not just the Ivies. It's like sort of it's most competitive schools or most highly selective schools that will require it. So unless there are some circumstances that make you think there's no case that they would want to be going to one of those schools, it can't really hurt, and it can only help. The essays are a really nice icing on the cake in a lot of ways.
And the essay always comes last on the exam?
Yes, that's one of the most difficult parts about it. They're burnt out. Yeah. They're freaking burnt out. On the ACT, they've just done 5 sections. 5 sections. They just went through like an hour of science. And the science on the ACT science section is very difficult. The level of focus that section requires is remarkable. And so going right into this essay is quite difficult. Give your students the greatest advice that I ever got when I was taking tests, which is just do jumping jacks between all the sections. Like get the blood flowing, get your body engaged, get your blood flowing so that you can do the thoughtful work that they'll need to be doing.
And in terms of, like, I know when you were talking about throughout the reading sections, like, they're not necessarily looking for the most sophisticated, complicated answer. Is it similar with the essay, and that students shouldn't overexert themselves writing the most complicated arguments?
Exactly. I think that making an argument that's clear and straightforward is so much more helpful than making like a really, really, really nuanced, personal, complicated gray area kind of answer, which is one of the reasons that I personally have ended up making a lot of arguments that are not true of what I actually think when I've taken these essays just to practice. For example, like I think it might have been the censorship one. My personal opinions are very, very civil libertarian on a lot of these issues. And so I was sitting there staring at the prompt thinking, okay, well, I have a lot of opinions about this issue. And with the information that's been given to me on this prompt, I know that the easier, cleaner, more straightforward, and more persuasive within 40 minutes essay that I can write is actually a different opinion than the one that I have. Mm-hmm. It's that same principle where they really just are looking for clarity and they're looking for conciseness, because frankly, that is what a lot of college writing is. That's what a lot of collegiate thought is. It's not necessarily about like sitting in the gray areas and mulling those gray areas. It's about being able to articulate things really clearly, and to eventually, further and further years of intellectual development down the line, your students will be able to articulate those gray areas. But you don't really have the time or the space or the educational background to be able to make those arguments yet.
Thanks.
Some of them have, and that's awesome. Like, great. I love getting proven wrong, but it really can be difficult. Mm-hmm. It's only 40 minutes. Mm-hmm. It's so short.
I have a quick question.
Yes, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh. Okay. So
Ooh, you're breaking up a little bit.
Yeah. You just to encourage our students to take the ACT with the writing. You encourage to take the ACT with writing, but what if they do very poorly on the writing section? Would that really, mess up their chances of, I don't know, getting into a good college? Or would that really like mess up their application? Do they have to show the writing section to colleges?
I mean, you don't have to submit all of your scores for all these things. I mean, I think that you can still selectively, you can sort of super score. I think if your student like really is doing well on the other sections and kind of bombs writing, I think then it's worth taking some time, because if they're doing well on the other sections, and they're probably, especially if they're doing well on English and on reading, then you know that the issue is not comprehension of these sort of bigger ideas. So I think that it just sort of taking some time to work on writing for this purpose would be great. I think that there are students where it's not going to help them. I personally haven't seen I personally haven't seen a student where I think that it like really negatively impacts their application package, so to speak. But I'm sure that there are cases where that is true. I think that like taking the ACT with the essay at least once is going to benefit upwards of 90% of your students. But it does depend on the student. It depends on the family and what kind of time and effort and money, frankly, that they're able to invest in that kind of thing. It's really, really hard to teach someone how to write. That is my main that's my sort of primary thing that I tutor. It's really, really hard to teach someone how to write. And it's really hard to teach someone how to write for this very, very specific genre. And so if you're kind of hitting a wall, I think that, and your student doesn't want to go to one of the schools that requires it, then you might as well just not submit it, frankly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. There's some like hip music playing behind me now, so I'll dance a little bit. We think about essay. We can go back and take questions for the other sections too, if that's helpful. And of course, for you all watching now and watching into the future, I'm always available, and I've sort of compiled my own little arsenal of tools and resources. And if you're ever looking for any of those things, or just want a recommendation for something, I'm around, and yeah, Kayla or Nathan can put you in touch with me, and I think that I'm going to send out a little bit of a list of like my favorite online resources to you all, so that you can just have those in your email, and then you can just pull them up when you're thinking like, oh, what was that thing Maggie was talking about? Boop, boop. And then it'll be right there.
Well, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Maggie.
Oh, yeah. Oh my gosh, I talked so quickly. I was so nervous about making it under 90 minutes.
Well, you did it. And I mean, I think the big takeaway is, as you pointed out, there are growing similarities between the SAT and ACT. The tests are really, beginning to resemble each other closely. And I think a lot of what you talked about in the SAT sessions is extremely applicable here as far as strategies and approaching each section goes.
They have really, they're really converging, I think, which again, hopefully is just going to benefit students. But it also makes, I mean, especially compared to 10 years ago, it makes taking both tests and doing a little bit of cross-training a lot easier for both tutors and for students. I have a couple students who've really just benefited from doing both tests together, and then just there's a little bit of an adjustment when you move to the next test. But I think that I believe pretty firmly that they're both better than when I took them, and things are getting better.
Right.
We just hope that all tests will continue to continue to push themselves and to continue to be better measures of how students are going to succeed in the future. I mean, I've got some pretty conflicted feelings about testing as a way to even examine aptitude or growth or achievement, but this is the devil that we've decided to live with as a society, and I think that the less intimidating that can be, the better, and the more that your students will be able to show the world and show colleges what they're really capable of further down the road.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, unless Alucci, do you have any more questions?
No.
Cool. Well, in that case, I will release you all into the world to learn some math and some science, and Godspeed. Happy teaching.